I never thought missing a single month's rent could make my entire life feel so small. It wasn't just the money. It was the silence that followed every ignored call. The way the walls of my apartment felt closer each night, like they were waiting for me to fail. I had always paid on time before. Always been responsible. Then one bad stretch turned into another, and suddenly I was behind with no clear way out. I told myself it was temporary, that something would work out, but hope doesn't pay rent, that I lived alone, and that loneliness amplified everything. There was no one to split the worry with, no one to help shoulder the panic that settled in my chest every evening. I'd lie awake counting hours instead of sheep, calculating how many days I had before the landlord would take action. Each notification on my phone made my heart race. When his messages finally came, they were polite at first, almost understanding. He said he knew times were hard. He said he just wanted to talk. That kindness somehow made it worse, because it left me no excuse to hide behind anger that I avoided him for longer than I should have. I convinced myself that if I didn't open the door, the problem would pause. It didn't. The final message was short and direct. He wanted to meet in person to figure something out. He added that he might bring a couple of friends along, people who could help discuss options. That line stuck with me. Friends. Options. I read it over and over, trying to hear it in a neutral tone, but something about it unsettled me. Still, I agreed. What choice did I really have? Eviction felt like a cliff edge, and this meeting felt like the last narrow bridge before it. I cleaned the apartment even though it didn't matter. I straightened things that didn't need straightening. Anything to keep my hands busy and my thoughts from spiraling. I practiced what I would say, how I would explain myself without sounding desperate, without sounding weak. I promised myself I wouldn't beg. When the knock finally came, it felt heavier than it should have, like it carried more than just people on the other side. I took a breath before opening the door, reminding myself that this was just a conversation, that I was still in control of my choices. The landlord stood there, just as I remembered him, but he wasn't alone. Two men stood slightly behind him, relaxed, almost too comfortable for a rent discussion. They smiled in a way that didn't reach their eyes. The air changed the moment they stepped inside. The apartment felt smaller with them in it, and I became acutely aware of my own situation, my unpaid rent, my dependence, my vulnerability. They sat like they belonged there, like this was their space too. The landlord spoke calmly, explaining that he wanted to help me, that he didn't want things to get ugly. His friends nodded along, adding comments about how life sometimes demands flexibility, how problems can be solved in unexpected ways. As I listened, I realized this wasn't just about money anymore. There was an unspoken layer beneath every word, something heavy and uncomfortable that pressed against my chest. I felt seen in a way I hadn't asked for, evaluated not as a tenant but as a person with leverage being weighed against her worth. Part of me wanted to stand up and end it right there. Another part, quieter but stronger, reminded me of how close I was to losing everything. I told myself I would just listen. Just hear them out. Just survive this conversation. I didn't know then that simply staying, simply not saying no right away, was already the beginning of a line I would soon cross. As the night stretched on, something subtle but irreversible shifted inside me. The laughter softened, the pauses between sentences grew longer, heavier. It wasn't what they said anymore, it was how they listened. Each of them, in their own way, gave me attention I hadn't realized I was starving for. Not loud, not crude, quiet, intentional, almost respectful. That made it more dangerous than anything obvious ever could. I became aware of myself in a way I hadn't in years. The sound of my own voice, the way my thoughts spilled out more freely than they should have. I shared things I usually kept locked away. How alone I felt some nights, how marriage can turn into routine without anyone noticing, how being strong all the time leaves no room to be weak. I didn't plan to confess any of that. Just happened. And they didn't interrupt. They didn't judge. They stayed with every word. That's when the guilt began to fight with something warmer. I told myself this was still innocent. People talk. People listen. Nothing was being done. But intention doesn't need action to become betrayal. I felt it growing quietly, like a thought you try to push away but keeps returning stronger each time. One of them said something simple. How my husband often took me for granted without realizing it. It wasn't an insult, just an observation. Still, it landed too deeply. I should have defended my husband immediately. Instead, I stayed silent, and that silence felt like agreement. I hated myself for it, yet I didn't correct it either. That moment cracked something open. The way they looked at me changed, or maybe I just started noticing it. Not hungry, not aggressive, curious. As if they were seeing me not as someone's wife, not as a responsibility, but as a woman with her own weight and presence. That realization sent a rush through me that I didn't want, yet didn't push away. I sat there listening to my heartbeat, aware that I was standing on a line I'd promised myself I'd never approach. I thought about getting up, creating distance, changing the tone. Instead, I stayed exactly where I was. Comfort can be a trap when it feels earned. I convinced myself that this attention was harmless because it felt earned through years of loyalty and sacrifice. I deserved to feel valued, I told myself. That justification slid into my mind so smoothly I barely noticed it take root. The conversation grew more personal. Each of them shared something vulnerable in return, as if balance was being restored. That made it easier to forget the roles we were supposed to play. Wife, friend, boundary. Those words began to blur, replaced by a shared sense of secrecy that no one named out loud. Secrecy has a way of bonding people faster than honesty ever could. That I checked my phone once, hoping maybe my husband had messaged. That reality would pull me back. There was nothing. The absence felt louder than sound. In that quiet, I realized how easy it would be to step further, how no one would know, how the night itself felt like it was holding its breath. That thought scared me more than anything else. I wasn't naive. I knew where this path could lead. Every instinct told me to stop, to end the night before it became something I couldn't undo. But another voice, calmer, more selfish, whispered that nothing had crossed the line yet, that I was still in control. That listening wasn't cheating. That wanting wasn't the same as acting. The truth I avoided was simple and terrifying. I wasn't being pulled forward anymore. I was walking on my own. And with every passing minute, turning back felt less likely than stepping ahead. I don't remember the exact moment when the line disappeared. I only remember realizing it was gone. The space between us felt smaller, not because anyone moved closer, but because something invisible had shifted. Words slowed. Eye contact lasted too long. Silence stopped being empty and started feeling full of things we were all pretending not to name. I tried to ground myself by focusing on ordinary thoughts. How late it was, how quiet the house had become, how my husband would laugh if he knew how serious our conversations sounded. That thought should have stopped me. Instead, it made everything feel unreal, like I was temporarily living someone else's life. A life where consequences existed somewhere far away. One of them spoke my name differently than before. Softer. Familiar in a way that felt personal, not polite. My body reacted before my mind could catch up. I hated that about myself in that moment. I hated how easily I responded to being noticed. Years of discipline, loyalty, and restraint felt fragile all of a sudden. Like they had been holding back something. Impatient and tired, I stood up at one point, telling myself I needed distance. It was an excuse I never completed. No one stopped me, but no one broke the tension either. The room felt suspended, as if we were all silently agreeing to let whatever was happening continue without anyone having to take responsibility for starting it. That shared understanding was intoxicating and terrifying at the same time. My thoughts kept circling back to my husband, his trust, his certainty in me. I wondered when I had started to feel so disconnected from that certainty. I wasn't angry with him. That almost made it worse. There was no villain to blame, no dramatic reason to justify what I was feeling. Just neglect stretched over time, unnoticed and unaddressed, until it turned into distance. The first physical contact was accidental enough to feel deniable. A brush of a hand, pause that lasted too long. No one reacted immediately, and that lack of reaction felt like permission. My heart raced, not with passion, but with the shock of how easy it was to let it happen. I could still stop, I told myself. I could still pull away and pretend nothing mattered. But pretending takes energy, and I was exhausted. What followed wasn't rushed or chaotic. That's what frightened me most. It felt deliberate, careful, almost gentle, as if everyone involved understood the weight of what was unfolding, and chose to step forward anyway. I wasn't overpowered. I wasn't persuaded. I was present, aware, and complicit. That truth sat heavily in my chest, even as I let myself continue. I kept waiting for a moment of clarity, A sudden wave of regret that would snap me back into who I was supposed to be. It didn't come. Instead, there was a strange calm, like I had stepped outside my own life for a brief, dangerous pause. In that pause, I felt desired, chosen, important in a way that had nothing to do with obligation. And yet, underneath it all, guilt never left. It watched silently, reminding me that whatever comfort I was taking now would demand payment later. I knew this wasn't just about one night anymore. Something had shifted inside me permanently. Even if I walked away right then, I would never be able to say I didn't know what I was capable of. When it finally slowed, when reality began to seep back in, the weight of what had happened pressed down on me all at once. No one spoke much. Words felt useless. The connection we had shared moments ago now felt fragile, dangerous, and unspeakable. I realized then that the hardest part wasn't what I had done. It was knowing I would have to live with it. The aftermath didn't arrive loudly. It crept in quietly, the way regret always does. When the night finally ended and I was alone again, the house felt unfamiliar, like it no longer belonged to the woman who lived in it. I sat in the silence, replaying everything again and again, searching for a version of the story where I could remove myself from responsibility. I couldn't find one. Why morning? The weight had settled fully in my chest. Nothing around me had changed, yet everything felt different. I moved through routine like a stranger, making tea, checking my phone, answering messages with practiced calm. When my husband called later that day, his voice sounded warm, trusting, unchanged. I responded the same way I always did. And that familiarity hurt more than anger ever could have. He asked how my night was. I told him it was fine. That lie came too easily. That scared me. The days that followed were worse than the night itself. Memory doesn't fade just because you wish it would. Every quiet moment gave my mind room to wander back, to question what it meant about me, about my marriage, about the choices I thought I would never make. I watched myself closely, wondering if something about me had been permanently altered or if this guilt was proof that I was still the same person who cared deeply about right and wrong. There were no dramatic confrontations. No sudden exposure. The world didn't collapse the way stories warn you it will. Instead, I lived with a private fracture no one else could see. That was the punishment. Carrying something that heavy while pretending nothing had happened required more strength than I expected, and more dishonesty than I wanted to admit I possessed. I avoided his friends after that. Distance became my only defense. Every message I ignored, every invitation I declined, was an attempt to build a boundary I should have enforced sooner. They didn't push. Maybe they understood. Maybe they carried their own version of guilt. We never spoke about that night again, and that silence became another secret layered on top of the first. What stayed with me most wasn't the act itself, but the realization of how quietly betrayal can grow. It doesn't always begin with desire. Sometimes it begins with exhaustion, with feeling unseen, with allowing small permissions to stack up until saying no feels harder than saying yes. I learned that loyalty isn't tested in dramatic moments. It's tested in quiet ones. When no one is watching, I still love my husband. That truth never changed. But love alone doesn't erase choices. It doesn't undo moments you can't take back. It only asks you to live honestly with who you've shown yourself to be. I had to confront parts of myself I didn't like, parts one had ignored because they didn't fit the image I tried to maintain. I don't tell this story for shock. I tell it as a warning, to myself and to anyone listening. Boundaries matter long before they're crossed. Loneliness deserves attention before it turns into justification. And trust, once placed in your hands, is easier to break than it is to repair. That night didn't ruin my life, but it changed how carefully I walk through it now. Because I know what one unguarded moment can cost, and how silently it can happen.